What if I told you that Mercedes found a way to earn illegal tenths without breaking the regulations? Because while everyone thought that the difference in classification was a matter of talent or aerodynamics, the FIA has just uncovered a hidden trick that fully exploited the MGUK right at the key moment, a detail so fine that it went unnoticed. Until now. The most shocking thing is not only the advantage it generated, but it completely shocked Ferrari, which suddenly understood that it was competing at a disadvantage without even knowing it. The big question is, how many poles were already decided before starting the lap? The context in which this whole scandal is born is absolutely key to understanding the magnitude of what the FIA has revealed, because we are not in just any Formula One, we are in a new technical era where the balance between electric power and thermal engine has completely changed the rules of the game, and it is precisely there where teams like Mercedes knew how to get ahead of the rest of the grid with an interpretation that no one else was seeing, or at least not with the same aggressiveness. From the first moment the new 2026 regulations were introduced, the engineers understood that the MGUK was no longer an add-on, but rather the central axis of performance, delivering up to 350 kilowatts, a figure that completely redefines how a qualifying lap is built, because now it is not just about aerodynamics or mechanical grip, but about how and when you use that electrical energy, and that is where a silent difference begins to take shape that little by little began to raise suspicions within the paddock. While teams like Ferrari worked on optimizing the progressive delivery of energy, respecting the logic of the regulations that sought stability and safety on the track, others began to explore extreme scenarios, looking for even the smallest legal loophole that would allow them to squeeze an additional advantage. And it was precisely at that point where this move, as fine as it was controversial, appeared, because it did not break the rule directly, but it did surround it in a way that completely changed its original intention. What began to attract attention were not obvious data, but strange sensations, minimal but constant differences in classification that did not quite add up, especially in the last sectors of the fastest laps, where some cars seemed to have an extra push just when it mattered most, an advantage that was not repeated in the race and that generated an increasingly uncomfortable mystery within teams like Ferrari, which could not replicate that performance despite having competitive packages. This is where the story begins to take shape because the key was not in the entire circuit. It was concentrated in the last meters of the lap, in that final moment where absolutely everything is decided, and where Mercedes found a way to maintain maximum energy deployment without suffering the progressive limitation imposed by the FIA, which in practice translated into an invisible advantage, impossible to detect with the naked eye, but totally decisive on the stopwatch. Ferrari, for its part, began to notice that something was not right, because the differences were not big enough to raise an immediate protest, but they were consistent enough to generate internal doubts. And that is what makes this case so interesting, because we are not facing an obvious trap, but rather a gray area of the regulation that is only revealed when someone decides to push the limits beyond what is conventional. And while all this was happening in silence, the FIA already had its focus on certain anomalous behaviors, especially on how some cars managed energy in the final moments of qualifying, something that would end up triggering a much deeper investigation, one that not only sought to understand if there was a competitive advantage, but if that advantage was crossing a much more dangerous line. Because what was at stake was no longer just who started first on Sunday, but whether Formula One had inadvertently allowed a technical solution that compromised the balance between performance and safety, leaving teams like Ferrari in a completely unexpected position, discovering that the battle was not being fought only on the track, but in the most extreme interpretation of the regulations. With all the information collected, the FIA no longer had doubts. Mercedes and Red Bull had taken the use of MGUK to an extreme level, taking advantage of this disconnection mode to completely eliminate the progressive limitation. And this not only gave them a direct advantage in classification, but also created a completely unequal situation compared to teams like Ferrari, which continued to use the system under a more conservative interpretation of the regulations. But the really tense thing comes when this finding stops being internal and begins to generate noise within the paddock, because Ferrari not only understands that it has been at a disadvantage, but also begins to question how many recent results have been conditioned by this detail, something that inevitably adds pressure on the FIA, which now has to decide how to act without unleashing an even greater controversy. And this is where the conflict intensifies because the FIA is in an extremely delicate position. Technically, it is not a direct violation, since the regulations did not explicitly prohibit this use of emergency mode, but at the same time it is evident that the spirit of the rule is being violated, which sought precisely to avoid sudden differences in power and dangerous situations on the track, which forces the organization to move quickly to close this gap before the problem escalates even further. Meanwhile, within Ferrari the impact is profound because they are not only dealing with a technical disadvantage, but with a much more uncomfortable reality. In today's Formula One, it is not enough to interpret the regulations well. You have to take it to the limit, and not doing so can mean losing key positions without even understanding why. Something that completely changes the way in which they must approach car development and strategy in qualifying. At the same time, the FIA begins to evaluate the real consequences that this system has already generated on the track, especially those situations where the cars were left practically without power after crossing the finish line, creating dangerous speed differences with other cars in the middle of a flying lap, a factor that ends up tipping the balance definitively towards intervention, because it is no longer just a matter of sporting justice, it is a matter of safety. This is the point where everything accelerates, because what was previously a silent advantage now becomes a visible problem, a threat that forces immediate decisions, and a clear sign that Formula One has returned to that terrain where innovation and regulatory limits collide head-on, leaving a question floating in the air. How far can we go before the FIA decides to stop the game? Once the tricks operation has been confirmed, the FIA makes a key decision: modify the technical interpretation of the use of the MGUK so that any type of disconnection, including the so-called emergency mode, must necessarily comply with a progressive reduction in power, completely eliminating the possibility of maintaining the 350 kilowatts until the last meter of the lap, which in practice destroys the advantage that these teams had achieved in qualifying. This movement changes absolutely everything because we are not talking about a small adjustment, but rather a direct intervention in how energy is managed at the most critical moment of performance, and that has an immediate impact on the balance of forces within the grid, especially in qualifying, where those free tenths disappear from one day to the next. For Ferrari, this is a total turning point because suddenly a disadvantage that they did not even know they were suffering in its entirety is eliminated, which reopens the competitive scene and returns a certain equality in a field where every thousandth defines key positions, but at the same time leaves an uncomfortable feeling. That of having been competing for several sessions under conditions that were not really equitable. Meanwhile, at Mercedes the blow is direct because they lose a tool that was part of their performance in qualifying, an advantage that was not only technical but strategic, perfectly integrated into the execution of their fast laps, which forces the team to rethink its approach and look for new ways to recover that lost margin against its rivals. But beyond the impact on each team, what this episode really leaves is a very clear message within modern Formula One. The regulations are not just a set of rules, it is an interpretive battlefield, where winning does not depend solely on building the fastest car, but on understanding better than anyone how far you can stretch the limits without breaking them. The FIA, for its part, emerges from this situation by reinforcing an idea that has already been seen on other occasions. Any innovation that compromises safety, no matter how ingenious, has its days numbered, and in this case the risk of cars decelerating suddenly in high-speed areas was the decisive factor to act quickly. And so this chapter closes with a lesson that resonates throughout the paddock. In Formula One, the greatest advantages are not always visible, but when they come to light, they can completely change the history of a season. The conclusion of this entire case leaves a clear and quite uncomfortable feeling within Formula One. The fastest car does not always win. Many times the team that best understands how far it can push the regulations without breaking it wins, and that is exactly what Mercedes did with this system that the FIA ended up dismantling. Because what seemed like a simple difference in classification ended up being one of the most aggressive interpretations of the new regulations. A millimeter play that exploited the MGUK at the exact moment where everything is decided, revealing a Ferrari that, without knowing it, was competing at a disadvantage in one of the most critical points of performance. But beyond who won or lost with this trick, what is truly important is what it represents. Because this episode confirms that Formula One continues to be a sport where innovation has no clear limits, where the rules are not only followed, they are interpreted, tense, and in many cases redefined in real time until someone, in this case the FIA, decides that a line has been crossed that cannot be allowed. It also leaves a key lesson for all teams. Playing safe is no longer enough because, while some respect the spirit of the regulations, others are constantly looking for how to exploit it to the maximum, and that mental difference can be as decisive as any aerodynamic improvement or evolution of the car. And perhaps the most shocking of all is that these types of advantages are not always visible, they do not appear in the cameras or in basic analysis, but they are there, deciding poles, positions, and results, until they finally come to light and completely change the narrative of what we thought we were seeing. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.